Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Joseph Riggio. So Joseph is a really interesting guy. He's got a strong background in coaching, consulting, NLP, some martial arts back in there, an architect I hear back in the day, works a lot with mythology. It's really hard to pin him down, actually. So Joseph, how would you describe yourself?
I like the description of hard to pin down, So let me give you the quick, I'm on an airplane, I'm sitting next to somebody and they go, "What do you do?" And I go, "I help people get their heads on right." And, normally they go, "Oh, so you're like a psychologist." And I go, No, I mean, literally, I help you get your head on right in terms of how it fits to your body. And that usually opens the door up,
Yeah, I listened to a couple of your TED Talks, and it was some of the few TED Talks I'd heard the body mentioned. So very cool to hear that.
Yeah, what's happening, it's interesting, Mark. I've been reading your stuff as well, and I appreciate what you put out there and the way you do it. And it is something that both fascinates me and disturbs me, that there's so few people who understand that human beings exist below the neck.
A simple thing. And just to kind of place you generally, where are you today?
I am in New Jersey, and most of the time in New Jersey, unless I'm literally on the road doing training or some consulting stuff, most of which occurs either in the UK or Denmark these days, although I get around a little bit other than that, but mostly the UK and Denmark if I'm not here in Jersey.
Now, did you grow up in that kind of area? I'm hearing a kind of sort of like East Coast, you don't have the annoying Californian softness going on. So is that where you're from?
Well, you have the East Coast thing, but I don't do the Jersey thing. If you want me to do it, I can do it for you. I can talk like a guy from Jersey if you want. And yeah, I'm from the East Coast, New Jersey, born and bred, and still here and loving it, actually. Easy to get out if I want to, but I keep finding my way back.
And what was your journey with the body? How did you get interested in the body as an area of study?
The simplest answer to that question is that what happened was many years ago, without going through the long, lengthy thing, call it 1990, late 1980s, I began studying neurolinguistic programming, NLP. And I was also simultaneously training dogs. And I kept thinking in the very first part of that training, if the guys who are teaching this stuff could do what they're teaching, it would be phenomenal. And what I began to associate it with is I was learning from the dogs as much as I learned from the folks I was studying the NLP and hypnosis stuff with, because the dogs forced me to be conscious of what they were doing that was nonverbal. And when I began applying that to what I was learning in the NLP material, my results were off the charts compared to people who were just trying to do it all up in the head and with words.
Yeah, so NLP, I've come across it in a few different ways, and it often has this focus on language. And I know you're very strong with language, so I do want to get into that. Though, one of the, as I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, one of the fundamental kind of tenets of NLP is the body matters, the body's important. But then I don't see many NLPers really working with it. They just kind of say that and then move on.
Yeah, and I think that that's true. I think that what they think working with the body means is very different than what I think. And I gave you, again, I'm trying to give you the information that will be useful for someone to understand the approach that I'm coming from when we talk about embodiment. But let me step back a few years, a decade earlier, when I was playing football in high school and college. And then I was a boxer, a competitive boxer and a competitive bodybuilder. And so I've been deeply involved in understanding how my own body works because I had an interest in performance. And it was just natural for me to be present to that as I was learning about how to, improve my mental performance. The separation, the distinction between this mind and body thing that some people make doesn't exist for me, Mark. And I don't think it ever really has, for better or for worse.
And, one way of describing you to someone would be something like communication expert. Like I've seen you do stuff on sales and all kinds of other kinds of communication, corporate world and personal stuff. Like, what to you is the role of the body in communication?
I think that, the fundamental source of both perception, which for me is the starting point of communication, of course, and then what happens as a result of response, what we manifest and express in communication, is the body. We're sensorial beings. We sense the world. And a very, very significant part of that is sensorial with regard to what we experience viscerally, what we actually feel within our own bodies, as well as what comes in from the outside. And people seem to talk about perception as though what's going on internally is less significant than what's happening externally that I'm perceiving. And to me, again, that seems a bit crazy.
Yeah, because any kind of external stimuli is landing in that substrate, right? I think, do you call it the implicit self, or this body kind of soup that anything out there lands in?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the ground of being, as I call it. So this implicit self is somatically based, and it's interesting, you use the terminology embodiment frequently, and we're talking on the Embodiment podcast. And some people use that word, especially in the NLP world, where I spend some time, to mean being present to what's happening in the moment. That's what they mean by embodied. And yet they leave out literally what's happening in the moment, the way that I experience as the corporeal being. And again, for me, a little nuts.
Yeah, one usage is just kind of mindfulness, like being present, but then the other usage is there's a self that's perceiving, that's communicating, that's in relationship, that's involved in all those things. So it's kind of how I would use it there. I've also heard you talk about like communication being not just about the content, right? Also being about the state that you're communicating.
Correct. So that, I think in our bodies, and I'd be curious actually to hear your opinion as well, whether this is something that you found in your work. We're communicating at this nonverbal level, what we're experiencing in a very immediate, absolute present way all the time, whether we intend to or not. And part of that is the experience we're having that I call state. So for simpler terms, for people who aren't familiar with that, let's just call it the emotional experience you're having in the moment. And the fundamental emotional experience we can divide into positive or negative, what I call excitatory and inhibitory. So are you open to experience, or are you closed down and avoiding, closing yourself off from new experience? But the body shows that. And if you know how to read it, you can't help but to notice it. It's there.
Yeah, and I guess some people are doing this more kind of unconsciously, and then is pretty big applications. This, for example, you train salespeople sometimes, right?
Correct. Yep. Salespeople, leaders in organizations, entrepreneurial, executive type individuals, and also lots of folks in relationships, frankly, who are just trying to figure out how to get along with their spouse a bit better, or raise children that they're happy to be around and happy to see go out in the world on their own.
So what's the first thing you tell, like a salesperson turns up, they've been referred to you, they think you're a good guy, so they say, right, teach me. What's the first thing you'd say to them about the body? Would it just be, you've got one, notice what it's doing, or would it be, notice clients? Like what's the kind of very first starting point for you with the body and communication?
I make this comment kind of lightly and frivolously, but I mean it very deeply. And it's that people have an experience that extends below the neck. So the starting point is always one's own body. And so the first thing I do with them is I create experiences. I don't talk about it. I use words to create experiences, and then I do things in a room to create experiences that they can't help but to have. And then I challenge them to notice what just happened. So I'll ask them, what just happened? They'll go, what do you mean? I'll go, what did you just do there? And they'll go, I don't know. And I'll go, well, you just reached up and rubbed your face. Why'd you do that? And it starts somewhere like that. I mean, I'm giving an example. Of course, it's not what happens all the time. But I tried to get them to recognize they've responded in a bodily, physical way. And there's a connection to what they're thinking, what they're experiencing, and what they're about to do next, based upon what they just did with their bodies and what that means for them.
Mm. And it seems like influence is one of the main areas you're working with. I saw a great talk about ethical manipulation from you. I mean, can you say something about the body and influence? I'd be keen to hear your take on that.
I think, again, if I go to this next step, let's say I've worked with someone, they've begun to recognize themselves. They begin to notice, oh my God, I'm actually doing things. And I have some ability to choose what I do. And what I do has an effect on how I feel and what I think and what's possible for me or not. then it must mean that everybody else beyond me has that same thing going on, because we share this common trait as humans of having a body. And so I help them to recognize, first and foremost, that people, as they're interacting with them, are also having a body-based experience. And I then help them to make a connection between what happens when a person does a certain thing and the words they express relative to that thing. So, when they're pleased and they begin to express pleasure in something, they do something very particular with their body. They lean in a particular way, or they gesture in a particular way. And I also help them to unwind some of the stuff that I would say they shouldn't do, Mark, like think that a smile means someone is happy.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes a smile means, I don't want to deal with you, go away.
Yeah, I'm nervous. Could be a bunch of things, right?
Sure.
Okay, I feel like most of what you've said around communication, to this audience on the podcast, will be fairly straightforward. I think it's pretty radical for many audiences, but for this audience, it's pretty straightforward, I imagine. What I'm thinking in some ways is that we should use your knowledge a little bit about narrative, because that's actually less commonly talked about by other guests. This idea that we live in story, we live in myth. Can you say something about that? Because it seems like that's a rich part of your work.
And it is, and I'm happy to. And let's do it two ways, if we may. So let's agree that there's what I refer to as autobiographical narrative, the story that you hold. And I always say there's three parts to that story. There's the story that you tell yourself. There's the story that you tell others about you. And there's also a story others tell about you. So those three parts comprise the total experience of the autobiography that you're living inside of, what we could call your personal myth. And I'll come back to that in a second, Mark, but I also want to mention there's a somatic narrative that you're living as well. And it's kind of the simplest way, and again, it may be common to the folks in this audience, but I think it's important to constantly reiterate, the simplest way to think about it is the way you feel. How do I feel moving through the world? Do I feel like the stuff that I want to achieve, the relationships I want to have, who I want to be are all possible for me? Or am I constantly recognizing a sense of limitation in one or all of those areas? And when that limitation is present, again, at this somatic level, at this body-based level, what am I doing? Because my body doesn't happen to me. It doesn't just do its thing and I have no interaction with it or no choice about it or no ability to modify it. But people get into these limited states and they're inside of a story of limitation. I can't X, have the relationship I want, be who I want, whatever it may be. And they completely ignore, darn it, if I just stood up and went for a walk, I'd feel differently right now.
Yeah, it's the beauty.
And this is not a useful way. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, just jumping in there. So the beauty for me of embodied work is it's like, okay, once I'm aware of something, I can change it. There's a choice. I can jump in. It strikes me, though, that the danger here is actually what people don't feel, not what's the emotion on top that they recognize, but what's the kind of implicit kind of embodied narrative that's like, it might be, I don't know, a cultural narrative like I was in Russia. So there might be like life is hard as an implicit cultural narrative that's in the body as a certain like despair or pushing. And they don't feel that because it's like the fish in water, right?
Right. I mean, if we take what you just said and bring my language interest and narrative interest into it, if in fact it's true that the narrative in Russia is life is hard, then in order to deal with life, I probably need to be at least as hard as it is. Mm-hmm. Or I'm going to somehow be at the effect of it. So how do I harden not just my mind? How do I harden my body? And how does holding my body in that hard way cause me to experience the world in a particular way day after day after day after day? And, shorten my life by 30 years because I'm constantly trying to be hard just to face life.
Yeah, there's a coherence between the body and the narrative, right? Like, so let's say it's like, it's hopeless. There's nothing we can do. That might lead to a kind of collapse or a lack of kind of action in the body. But that in the body also leads to that narrative and change of thought and perception and the other things. So there's a kind of coherence between those different elements, whether they be narrative or embodied.
Absolutely. And so if we go to that idea, one of the things we said that, I'm hopeless and I can't do anything. Therefore, I have a sense of collapse, people then, in my experience, many people then try to get into their head and fix the hopelessness. What do I have to be thinking so that I don't feel hopeless? Or how can I change what I'm thinking about? Or can I visualize what it would be like to be hopeful? And I always tell people, it's really difficult to change your mind. For 90% of the people I've encountered, 99.99% of the people I've encountered, changing their body is a heck of a lot easier.
Yeah, because
it's easier for them literally to stand up than to change their mind.
It's direct, right? Like trying to change your mind is the mind is held in place by the body, whereas the body, people will try stuff. They'll, something like standing up or walking differently. That's usually something people are willing to give a go.
Right. And also from the outside, right? You and I could, if we're working with a client or a group, get them to do something if they're willing to follow an instruction per se, or even literally if I do physical coercion, which I wouldn't, I could make someone do something where I can't get into their mind and change their thought directly.
Nice. And I know for you, like you look at this in terms of people might hear the word story or narrative and not get kind of how deep some of these can be, how these can be totally lived, kind of unconscious bodily, day-to-day experiences. Also this idea that I know you're interested in Joseph Campbell's work and mythology. So speak to a little bit about some of the sort of deeper story, the deeper structure of story that's there.
So let's do that. Let's kind of make that bridge now, getting back to the narrative, but the language part of it, you could say, the verbal part. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Stanley Kellerman. Yeah. Stanley Kellerman was, so the author of Emotional Anatomy. Stanley Kellerman and Joseph Campbell wrote a book together about myth and body. And this idea that you're referring to is actually really interesting because of my interest in Joseph Campbell, to me in particular. And that is that one of the phrases I love, and I hope you can enjoy it from Joseph Campbell, is that myth is organ language. And it's the energy swirling in the organs that arises as the myth of humanity. And that the myth is the dream depersonalized. So each of us has dreams, and those dreams hold what we call mythic form. And mythic form is always kind of out of time. And I don't mean there's no time available. I mean, it doesn't exist in the ordinary sense of past, present, or future. It exists in a timeless way where we project ourselves into an experience like once upon a time. When is that? When is once upon a time, right? Every story that we've heard starts once upon a time. And it's designed to literally remove the consideration of time as we normally hold it, because it can be any time, now, then, after, before. And we project ourselves mythologically to holding a kind of identity. And there are levels of it. So there's the broken hero as well as the reclaimed hero that we might simultaneously have a sense of within ourselves. We have a desire, a yearning to know ourselves in a particular way. And we also experience ourselves in a particular way that might not match up to that yearning. Right? And this has a resonance within both our thoughts, the story that we tell ourselves about who we are and what's possible and not possible, as well as in the way that we literally experience it physically as we are knowing ourselves to be, because we know ourselves to be as physical beings.
What do you find is kind of most practical, most useful for people?
Oh, I hate that question. I'll do my best, but I hate that question.
Tell me why you hate it, then. That's maybe a better question.
Okay, I hate the question because it's suggestive of the idea that everything we've been talking about so far might not be practical, or that having a philosophical conversation around mythology and the body isn't practical.
Got it.
That unless we're constantly moving to doing something, and there's a result that we have to produce, and there's achievement to be realized, that it's not practical. And I think practical is all about living the life that's worth waking up to every morning. That to me is the most practical thing. And if I wake up and I feel good and I haven't done anything yet other than open my eyes to feel good, that's a pretty darn practical result for me.
Sure. I understand that. You work in business like I do, right? And there can be, I'm hearing some sort of historical pain there around that particular pressure that's sometimes put on, like, give us something practical. And I'm like, hey, what's more practical than being alive? What's more practical than being human?
Right. And like one of the things that comes up a lot for me, Mark, and I would like to speak to it in two ways with you, is that I often hear this phrase, let's get on with it. Like, you're taking too long, Joseph. Why are you spending so much time with Sarah pointing out every little tiny muscular movement that she's making while Sarah's in ecstasy? Sarah's, she's orgiastic. She's like in an experience that she only dreamed she could have with the 75 men she's dated so far. And she ain't being touched yet. So that is something that I get frustrated with, is let's get on with it. Well, we're getting on with it.
Yeah.
The other thing I love, just since I'm ranting, I'll share the final part of that rant, is people going, well, in the real world or in real life. And I'm like, guys, this is my real life. This is like how I show up and act every day, whether I'm with you or I'm with my daughter or I'm with my girlfriend. This is my life.
Yeah, that gave me an urge to do embodied work with the groups that are considered most practical, inverted commas, or most real, like soldiers and police and business, because I almost wanted to be like, look, fuck you, give me who you got. Let's see, you want practical, whatever. Like,
right. And the guys, I love those guys. I mean, the soldiers I've worked with, and I've worked with a bunch of elite soldiers in different countries, by the way. They're the ones who just go, this makes perfect sense. Why hasn't anybody ever showed me this shit before?
I like working with soldiers. They turn up on time. They're polite. They do the fucking work. And I have no problem working with soldiers or police, actually, at all. But, yeah. Okay, so...
So let me jump in there, if I may, with something else I wanted to kind of get to. So this is kind of a recent thought for me, just in the phrasing of it, not necessarily in the idea of it. But I was having a conversation with a client the other day, and he was asking me about something practical. I need to get to the stuff, Joseph, because it feels like we spent enough time working on me getting my state corrected or starting from a good position. And I went, here's the challenge. As I understand it, in the cultures that we live in, any first world culture, any industrialized culture, any modern or postmodern culture, the imposition of the sociocultural form to be productive, number one, which means fundamentally become a good consumer. And that means we have to be able to earn enough money to consume and then use the money we earn to buy things that we then have or use. And this is the imprint that every child coming into that cultural form has put on them pretty much from the moment they leave the womb.
Deeply
become a good consumer.
Yeah, and there's not enough time. Your time is precious. Make use of your time, by producing and consuming, and a certain view of what constitutes reality and what constitutes practicality, like get real and get practical, right? There's
absolutely
a deeply embedded frame in just a general kind of culture and economic system.
Totally. So I know this. I don't care if I've met you at 8 or 18 or 38 or 80. This is probably going to be part of the cultural bias that was imposed upon you, as I said, pretty much from out of the womb. And yet, the people I meet have this deep ontological angst, this deep ontological yearning to know who they are. They recognize something is untrue fundamentally about the way they're experiencing themselves in the matrix of this narrative. And what I say to them is this, that early on, there was a truth that was present. And every time that truth showed up and it was in conflict with this sociocultural, message of being productive, performing in a particular way, becoming a good consumer that is good and fits into the way culture says you should be, society says you should be, it's shut down. But the kernel of that youth, the kernel of that individual who was present in that moment of full awareness and the fullness of experience of just being alive remains, and now is still yearning to get out, is still yearning to be present. And every time you shut that down, it builds a kind of minor crisis that now needs to be resolved. And these crises show up physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, in our relationships, in our frustration with career. And that's practical.
Yeah.
Let me help you get to that.
The call to adventure, right? That kind of inner embodied sense of like, hey, I want to be alive. I want to actually, what's the best way to say it? But that call to adventure in Joseph Campbell's model, or that call to life, really. And to ignore that always creates a consequence, whether it's just, disconnection from your wife, or, a serious health issue, or just a slight sense of mis-ease in the body that then has to be covered up with alcohol or whatever. That's the disembodiment that's necessary to ignore the call to adventure.
Absolutely. And the result of that, let's call it, is that when you accept the call to adventure and you become truly present to your own experience of being alive in all ways, both in body and mind and spirit, you begin to experience the world differently. And this is what winds up happening when I work with clients, whether it's one-to-one or in groups, is they come back and they go, that stuff that I was complaining about, that we were spending a lot of time on and wasting my time because we weren't getting to it. All of a sudden, my wife asked me, what's different? And why are we getting along so well all of a sudden? And I kind of realized, for the first time in 20 years, I actually felt her touch me. And, this is the kind of stuff that literally shows up for me. And I would argue there are experiences that we have that if we simply attend to them, have the great potential of saving our lives. And more importantly, in some ways, because I think life is very finite for everyone, makes the life that you have while you have it worth living. And I think there's a lot of people who are moving through the world in an ongoing way, Mark, who just, their life isn't worth living. They bought so deeply into these perverted narratives, these corrupt narratives about who they should be and how they should be, that they refuse to be present to who they are and what's therefore possible when they would be like that.
Yeah, it's
if they could be like that.
Profound alienation there. So, how do you get people in contact with other narratives? I mean, I know sometimes you use movies, right? For example, I think the first person we've had on that I've heard, talks about movies and stories. We also haven't explained to some of the listeners, what Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey is, because that may not be familiar to everyone.
What do you mean? Everyone hasn't read his books?
Well, I only started my business because my friend Lance Giroux sat me down in front of Bill Myers interviews. My entire business comes out of Joseph Campbell. I sat down for 3 days and watched 3 days of interviews with Joseph Campbell, and afterwards was like, right, I'm doing something in my life, And
yeah.
But it's particularly, I think, he's better known in the States than in Europe, I would say, and in certain circles and not others. Like, I'm not sure if the average yoga teacher has heard of the hero's journey. Like, that's.
I think you're probably right. Yeah, and I'm being facetious and teasing, of course. But to get to your question, how do you do this? How do I do it? You ask me. Is with great provocation. I'm from Jersey, and New Jersey guys grew up in, to some extent, the part of the world where if you make it to adulthood, you have proven that you are the equivalent of the human roach. We're attacked by everything. Whether it's the living on the streets and growing up with getting into physical confrontation on a relatively regular basis, or it's dealing with radiation poisoning from radon in the soil, or the smokestacks of factories, or whatever it might be. And so provocation comes naturally to me. I'm very comfortable with confrontation. And so I like to point out to people, where they're full of shit. That really is how I do the work I do.
And listening to a bunch of videos and talks that you did, I was like, okay, get it, meta narratives, NLP, good stuff. This guy's clearly, an expert, clearly a senior consultant. I'd love to kind of be in one of your seminars. The other main thing that stood out maybe more though is your tone. So you're kind of like a son of a bitch, like you're like me. There's a pushing, there's a provoking, like a slightly sarcastic, and that's rare. Like, I can think of very few TED Talks, for example, that have that slightly sort of rough working class, Detroit, New Jersey, and Britain, there's different areas, I'd say. Like, that's actually quite rare in the personal transformation field, no?
I think you're right. And I think that's distressing. If we can't recognize how full of shit we are, that's a problem. And sometimes all these people are trying to be really nice and glad-handing, verbally or physically, do it to cover up their own shit, right? So the reason I'm so comfortable calling out everybody else is because I get that I ain't born perfect, and I ain't going to make it perfect, between now and the time I end this whole thing. So I want to be as real as possible, and I'm not particularly tolerant of people who are full of shit.
Yeah, I think
so. That's kind of the basis.
It's an overrated virtue in certain contexts, as is politeness from an English point of view. And I think you probably share my point of view on the the dangers of not being able to speak the truth because it's not politically correct as well. And there's a certain kind of weird repression happening, and the kind of slightly rude guy is, I know this is a huge shadow for Britain that I trigger, and some people love me for it and some people hate me for it. And I think it's slightly biased against men and against the working class particularly, and against a particular personality type of it being kind of unacceptable to be that blunt.
I think you're right. And I think, again, if we can go back to the essence of, where you and I kind of meet, it's, felt in a very particular way. There's this idea Eugene Gedron talked about of the felt sense of self. And, it feels uncomfortable for most people to be in confrontation. It feels uncomfortable not to acquiesce to the common popular narrative.
How the fuck do you
yet,
Denmark?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that I find probably in the world, the most intentionally politically correct people may be here in the United States.
Yeah,
the second most politically correct people are probably there with you. And outside of that, I find less and less of it until I get all the way out, east in Asia in some places, where it's just not proper to ever confront in public. You just don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
But the Scandinavian countries do it a lot.
I see a directness there, but I do see a sensitivity as well, and the kind of sort of far left kind of political correctness quite strong. I've seen in those countries. Though I get what you're saying. There can be a directness which would be out of place in, say, Southeast Asia. There's an idea here about responsibility for emotion. I've been coming across this recently, and I wonder how this relates to kind of your work, that you're an influence on other people, influences your work, but are you responsible for their emotional reaction? So that seems to be, that confusion seems to be at the heart of a lot of the kind of more politically correct stuff I'm seeing lately.
I'm going to give you the personal answer, the one that I share, with myself, so to speak. And the answer is yes. If I am unconsciously provoking negative, distressing experiences in others in an ongoing way and taking no responsibility for that, that's my definition of truly being an asshole or a shithead.
Mm-hmm.
If I do it with awareness and I say, hey, listen, this is the stance I have in the world, and I'm going to hold this stance. And if you provoke me, you also have to be responsible for what you get from me. But I don't have a need to dump my garbage on other people if they hold a different position in the world. I don't need to make them see the light of my truth.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of people who are on, I'm going to call it the other side of political correctness, who do feel that they have not just a right, but an obligation to dump their view of the world on the world.
Yeah.
And then that tends not to work particularly well with me.
Yeah. And what I saw in this talk, I watched the video in Denmark, and tell me if this is wrong, was like, first of all, it was working at a body level. As soon as you stood up, the provocation was already happening. And the second thing was that the audience had a kind of mix of sort of being delighted and disturbed at the same time. So did I read that right? Like, that's kind of how...
I'm not sure which video exactly you're referring to, but that's pretty common, so it sounds right.
Yeah, I mean, my sense was this was not a one-off. So.
Right. And here's the thing. You come into my room. By the time you've met me, or you've invited me to give a speech and you're the director of the program, you know about me. I've made sure that you know what's going to happen by the time you encounter me. So don't be surprised that I'm going to challenge your audience or challenge you directly when we get together. That's what I get paid for. I get paid to point out the inconsistencies. I get pointed out the paid hypocrisies that show up in myself and in others. And I use my own hypocrisies, my own inconsistencies, to try to make evident for others their own as well.
Yeah, and as you say, I think this is, your somatic reputation does need to precede you. I've found, I go to great lengths to make sure people have seen videos or seen things that I've done before they come to a training, so they can make a really informed choice, like, hey, do I want to be Pope today? Or actually, maybe I'm a bit too broken and it's not the place to be coming. You need to be robust to come to my trainings, and I'm guessing yours too. So there's that kind of realistic expectation, so they're actually signing up for it.
Yeah, I mean, I just put an application together for a training I'm doing in this summer for the Smith of Self work that I designed. And in that, I put a very clear disclaimer. And the disclaimer says, this is intense and demanding. And if you don't feel like you're up for an intense and demanding experience, both physically and mentally, it's probably better that you don't apply.
Yeah.
So I make it very clear. And the other thing is, there is a value that society has seemed to want to negate and yet demands at the same time to have a certain number of badasses in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And you can be a physical badass, you can be a mental badass, you can be an emotional badass, you can be a spiritual badass. But it's this ability to put a stake in the ground and become an indomitable, immovable force relative to that position you've now chosen to hold.
Yeah.
And men need to get this, especially. You said, men maybe especially. There aren't enough badass men around as far as I'm concerned. And one of the things that I have repeatedly been accused of, rightly, is pointing out to men that they have a set of testicles and they have to know what it feels like when they're vibrating.
Yeah.
And if you don't ever have your testicles vibrating, you ain't lived.
Yeah, and I feel like society has a weird demand on this, because on the one hand it says we want castrates who do as they're told and don't really feel their bodies, their testicles and all their hearts and all the rest of it. And on the other hand, like, can strongly reward this. And I sometimes feel I'm almost like playing it out for other people, particularly in the UK. There's a way in which there's a lot of people sort of cheering it on or kind of delighting in it. And the other thing I see with it is quite strong reactions in terms of attraction and repulsion. Like I've never had a shortage of girls to date or customers. And at the same time, you get hate mail, So there's a way in which it polarizes, and society has this very ambiguous relationship to both loving it, but also saying, yeah, but don't do it.
Absolutely. It's terrifying. You have to understand, for someone, the average person is not able to get there in the fullness of what we're referring to now. And so for them, it's a terrifying thing to encounter and experience someone who does. And one of the things, since we're having a bit of a conversation around the male-female thing and embodiment in relation to that, is frankly, if a man doesn't experience his own sense of, as I put it, his badassness, he can't be with a woman who's truly strong. Then we have these women who are truly strong, some of them that I've met and many I've been with, who they want men who are strong, but they send signals that they want men who are weak. So they confuse the people around them in a way that is not useful, to say the very least.
Yeah, or they go for men who are brutal as a swingback because of the kind of repression of strong. So it becomes, either odd, sort of shadowy attraction to the kind of brutal side. I also see that in a lot of guys, watching a lot of kind of violent films and imagery. I wonder if there's not some repression of that kind of like there's a lot of TV shows where the lead character, like House, he's kind of an intellectual badass, or, serial killers, or, kind of anti-heroes. I wonder if there's some of the repression of that badass isn't why some of these characters are so popular. And then, the anti-heroes. And then on the other hand, and then also the sort of super violent movies that is like most of Hollywood, right?
I agree. I think that there's a lot of repression, a lot of resistance and rejection and repulsion of these natural fundamental urges. I get in arguments regularly on Facebook and other places about the innate tendency for males especially, but not just men, women have it too, towards aggression. Part of the human experience is we're an aggressive species. We're a violent, cannibalistic and carnivorous species in many ways. And until we can accept that, we can't transcend it. People want to transcend what they haven't yet accepted. Like, how do you do that? How do you transcend what you haven't yet accepted to be true? I can't even comprehend that, Mark.
Yeah, the denial of it doesn't actually help, does it? And this comes out in kind of weird sideways ways or sudden explosive ways. And, some of the people I most trust as guys are like martial artists that know 1,000 ways to kill you.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand that. I've been studying various ways to experience confrontation because, frankly, at some level, I enjoy it. I know that's a little bizarre, but it's a lot of fun for me to mix it up and to do it in a controlled environment,
The addiction for me in conflict sometimes is that it's very intense, isn't it? So it brings a kind of a color and a vividness to life when there's conflict.
Yeah, I mean, to put it into kind of a trite phrase, it's never quite so apparent to us how absolutely delicious life is until we may be facing the possibility of its end. And whether that's in the near miss in a car accident, or walking down a street and you realize you just escaped being mauled by three, hoodlums who wanted to possibly take your money and your life, whatever it might be, or just the thrill of it on a movie screen where you can experience it vicariously. If you can tap into that a little bit, you get waking up tomorrow is the gift. That's going back to our practical conversation. That's the gift.
I often think a very good restaurant would be, a good restaurant idea would be one that gives you a sort of near-death terrorist experience before the dinner. Everyone sort of has bags put on their head and guns put to their heads, and then, then you find out it's all a joke, and then you get the food, So, I often thought that would be a great restaurant.
Michael Douglas, The Game, talking about your movies, right?
Fight Clubby, so...
Yeah.
What's your learning edge right now? What for you is the point of going, okay, this is challenging, or I'm really discovering this aspect?
Well, I'm actually, I've been studying for a number of years now, about 5 years, this martial art called guided chaos, which is completely unscripted. I mean, there are no patterns, there are no forms, there are no specific responses you're supposed to have, or even striking techniques you're supposed to learn or anything like that. It's designed to replicate the ability to respond to chaos. And the founder of the art, John Perkins, talks all the time about violence being chaotic. And he knows something about it, having been a blood splatter expert for the Yonkers Police Department in New York. He's also got a history himself of many things, including being a police officer and a bare knuckle fighter and a couple of other things. And the edge there for me is, can I take this learning about what it is to push myself to an extreme in the face of violent confrontation, which is what the art is about, and bring that back to the center of my life, where I'm sitting on a sofa watching a television show with my daughter, and be as fully present in that moment as I am when some 6'3", 250-pound monster is trying to knock my block off. And I have to make an instantaneous decision about how to respond to that in, again, a controlled environment, but not so controlled that if I make major mistakes, I won't get hurt significantly.
Interesting. I've seen a few. I just Googled it. And it looks interesting, fun, and brutal. And I've seen a few.
All that.
Yeah, I've seen a few sort of offshoots of Krav Maga that are a bit like this, where they really kind of pressure test you in kind of extreme ways. But I love what you said there, that we can do these extreme sports or extreme martial arts, and most embodiment people go through a stage of doing, cage fighting or parkour or some sort of snowboarding, some kind of extreme thing, particularly guys when they're young. And then, the difficult part of the hero's journey is the return home, right? In Joseph Campbell's model, that's considered in some ways the hardest part of the model, not the kind of just the call to adventure, the refusal of the call, the belly of the whale when you're right in the ship. But then the return home is the really tricky thing. How can you do this?
It's really tricky because it's so choiceful, right? It's so open to, you're going to leave behind some of that adrenaline charge. You're going to leave behind some of that excitement that was present in the belly of the whale. And for many men especially, not again just for men, many women as well could share the same experience, that adrenaline rush is what it's all about. And now sitting at home and just living a typical, quote unquote, ordinary life, watching the tulips bloom, feels empty and meaningless. This is the challenge, is bringing meaning to it. That's your job, so to speak.
Yeah, and I certainly had some, I did some work in war zones when I was young, and then coming home was really tricky, and that
exactly. My point exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Well,
so there's another piece that I just want to kind of briefly tap into or touch on here, because you asked me about a learning edge. I think the most interesting thing I'm doing right now, the most interesting work I'm doing right now, is I'm taking from some of the things I've been experiencing over these last 5 years, especially with guided chaos, and then the 30 years prior to that of studying this material from all kinds of angles and facets and positions. And I'm bringing it into a question of what I refer to as the integration of the fast and slow brain, literally the different fundamental physiological processing mechanisms that we possess as humans in our nervous system to make sense of information slowly and quickly, because they're two different systems. And these are related very deeply to the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems when we're in stress and when we're in calm, so to speak, and helping people to intentionally and deliberately manage how they move through these positions, and where and when it's most useful to be in fast brain or slow brain, where and when they have to get up to speed instantaneously, and how can they access that without being on the edge of, constant cortisol thrumming in their life.
Yeah, that's the danger, isn't it? The addiction to the adrenaline and being in that kind of high cortisol, low empathy, high adrenaline state.
Right. And especially because I think, Mark, some of the most important work you and I can do as embodiment specialists, to use a term, is to help people get the real depth and value in the relationships they have, the intimate relationships they have, whether that's with a lover or a parent or child or a good friend, because I think that's where the juice of life is in the relationships ultimately we have. And everybody I've talked to who crosses the threshold into recognizing they're at the edge or approaching their own death, this is the only conversation they want to have, is who was present in their life that mattered, and how were they present to those people. If we don't get this, we miss what it is to be human.
Meaningful relationship.
It's not about establishing a profound career or doing something that needs a legacy of performance behind you. Nobody gives a shit when they know that they have 7 breaths left.
Nice. Talk about Dudeism. We're almost out of time, and I left some fucking surreal comments on my Facebook the other day about the dude. So I think let's line it up, and we'll go straight from kind of 7 last breaths to the dude.
Okay, so the dude, the Big Lebowski, right? The movie, the Coen Brothers movie, and Jeff Bridges, the primary actor in the Coen Brothers movie, The Big Lebowski, is the dude. And a couple of years ago, especially with my current girlfriend Laura, she keeps referring to me as the dude, and mostly because I started referring to myself that way. And the reason is that there's this concept of abiding, which simply means being present to what's happening and accepting this is happening. This is what's happening. And now I get to make a choice. And the choice is always, what will I do in regard to what's actually happening? And Dudeism is that form of philosophy or religion, if you want to call it that takes all these esoteric, foreign ideas out of, for a Westerner like me, born and bred in the United States, in New Jersey especially, from the Orient, from the East, from the Levant,
basically.
Right, all the Taoist stuff, Taoism, and also Zen and Confucianism and these other ideas that come from those areas, Buddhism, and makes it very practical to go back to the beginning of our conversation, where it's like, okay, this is going on, what do I do? Who do I want to be right now, right here, in regard to what's happening? And, it's very clever and funny the way Dudeism approaches it. And Dudeists around the world recognize one another because we keep throwing at one another clever comments like that rug really ties the room together, and it's these simple ideas where, hey man, I got a drink here, meaning, keep your own space, be aware of how you're moving through the world. And I won't step on your toes, but I got toes too. Don't step on mine. And I love the cleverness in the idea behind Dudeism. And I love the idea that on my corporate website, I make very clear that I'm a Dudeist priest, because there's a subtext there. If this is going to offend you, don't hire me. I'm probably not for you.
Yeah, it's a little head on a spike, isn't it? I like to sprinkle those around the place as well. It's like, hey, if you can't handle the dude, you're probably not going to be able to handle what you're going to get with me. So that is fun. So your website is joseph&nbsp.com. So if people go there, there's a few resources there. There's links to your YouTube, some videos, there's some good stuff there that I'm going to take a look at when we get off the line. Is there anywhere else you'd point people to in terms of looking at your stuff?
I actually point people probably just as frequently these days to Facebook and my interactions on Facebook. I spend a lot of time there with great intention. I think it's the public discourse space, right? This is the new court of where people gather and meet. We don't do it anymore in front of the palace. We do it on Facebook, and I get excited about that. I love the immediacy of the interaction. Frankly, I get that I'm addicted to the dopamine rush of being able to interact and get immediate response and see how people are affected by and affecting me in what goes on between us. So I would say that's the place that I enjoy spending time and interacting with people. That's not literal, but virtual.
Great. You're really generous there as well. I've seen you leave some really thought through and, very lengthy kind of intelligent comments on a bunch of stuff that I was doing, and I'm sure on other people's stuff too. So, I've had good interactions with you there. I hear nothing but good things about your coaching and training as well. Like a few times I've said to people, who's the best trainer in the world? And your name came up, actually. And, people that I know have pretty high standards. So, if people are interested in training and coaching, I guess they can look at your site. And then there's this generative NLP as well, right?
Generative NLP is a friend and a colleague's site, Charles Moore, who's a licensed Mythos Self trainer. And his site is really a remarkable treasure trove of resources. A lot from me, but a lot from other people as well. And I absolutely recommend that. That is a site somebody should make a point of spending time. It should be on your bucket list, if nothing else, to get to generative-nlp.com. He's just he's put together a heck of a resource.
There's a lot there. I've just started skimming it. There's just a huge amount there. So I'll link that to the podcast as well. So Joseph, do you have a final message about the body? Because we're almost on time.
No. My final message is Buckminster Fuller's message. There's a lot more I could say, but we've run out of time. But the thing that I would like to say most of all at this moment is really thank you. I appreciate you making the time and the space so we could have a conversation. As I said, I've been following your stuff as well on Facebook. I find the approach and the commentary and the perspective interesting, even when we disagree. And we've disagreed at some moments, and we agree a lot. But I always appreciate having a colleague who is out there making space for the world to happen and inviting me into that space like you have here. So thanks so much. And I'll be excited to see both who shows up for what we've done, and as well as see the other stuff that you're putting together with people you're bringing on after me.
Joseph, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy guy, so thank you.
Cheers.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.